Section 15 of On Benefits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arden. On Benefits by Seneca. Translated by Aubrey Stewart. Book 5, Chapters 7 to 16. 7. I think that we have sufficiently discussed this part of the subject, whether it be disgraceful to be worsted in a contest of benefits. Whoever asks this question must know that men are not wont to bestow benefits upon themselves, for evidently it could not be disgraceful to be worsted by oneself. Yet some of the Stoics debate this question, whether anyone can confer a benefit upon himself, and whether one ought to return one's own kindness to oneself. This discussion has been raised in consequence of our habit of saying, I am thankful to myself. I can complain of no one but myself. I am angry with myself. I will punish myself. I hate myself. And many other phrases of the same sort, in which one speaks of oneself as one would of some other person. If, they argue, I can injure myself, why should I not be able also to bestow a benefit upon myself? Besides this, why are those things not called benefits when I bestow them upon myself, which would be called benefits if I bestowed them upon another? If to receive a certain thing from another would lay me under an obligation to him, how is it that if I give it to myself, I do not contract an obligation to myself? Why should I be ungrateful to my own self, which is no less disgraceful than it is to be mean to oneself, or hard and cruel to oneself, or neglectful of oneself? The procurer is equally odious whether he prostitutes others or himself. We blame a flatterer, and one who imitates another man's mode of speech, or is prepared to give praise whether it be deserved or not. We ought equally to blame one who humors himself and looks up to himself, and so to speak is his own flatterer. Vices are not only hateful when outwardly practiced, but also when they are repressed within the mind. Whom would you admire more than he who governs himself and has himself under command? It is easier to rule savage nations, impatient of foreign control, than to restrain one's own mind and keep it under one's own control. Plato, it is argued, was grateful to Socrates for having been taught by him. Why should not Socrates be grateful to himself for having taught himself? Marcus Cato said, borrow from yourself whatever you lack. Why then, if I can lend myself anything, should I be unable to give myself anything? The instances in which usage divides us into two persons are innumerable. We are wont to say, let me converse with myself, and I will give myself a twitch of the ear. Footnote. See Book 4, Chapter 36, end of footnote. And if it be true that one can do so, then a man ought to be grateful to himself, just as he is angry with himself, as he blames himself. So he ought to praise himself, since he can impoverish himself. He can also enrich himself. Injuries and benefits are the converse of one another. If we say of a man, he has done himself an injury, we can also say he has bestowed upon himself a benefit. 8. It is natural that a man should first incur an obligation, and then that he should return gratitude for it. A debtor cannot exist without a creditor, any more than a husband without a wife, or a son without a father. Someone must give, in order that someone may receive, just as no one carries himself, although he moves his body and transports it from place to place, as no one, though he may have made a speech in his own defense, is said to have stood by himself, or erects a statue to himself as his own patron. As no sick man, when by his own care he has regained his health, asks himself for a fee, so in no transaction, even when a man does what is useful to himself, need he return thanks to himself, because there is no one to whom he can return them. Though I grant that a man can bestow a benefit upon himself, yet at the same time that he gives it, he also receives it. Though I grant that a man may receive a benefit from himself, yet he receives it at the same time that he gives it. The exchange takes place within doors, as they say, and the transfer is made at once, as though the debt were a fictitious one. For he who gives is not a different person to he who receives, but one and the same. The word to owe has no meaning except as between two persons. How then can it apply to one man who incurs an obligation, and by the same act frees himself from it? In a disc or a ball, there is no top or bottom, no beginning or end, because the relation of the parts is changed when it moves, what was behind coming before, and what went down on one side coming up on the other, so that all the parts, in whatever direction they may move, come back to the same position. Imagine that the same thing takes place in a man, and to however many pieces you may divide him, he remains one. If he strikes himself, he has no one to call to account for the insult. If he binds himself and locks himself up, he cannot demand damages. If he bestows a benefit upon himself, he straightway returns it to the giver. It is said, that there is no waste in nature, because everything which is taken from nature returns to her again, and nothing can perish, because it cannot fall out of nature, but goes round again to the point from whence it started. You ask what connection has this illustration with the subject. I will tell you. Imagine yourself to be ungrateful. The benefit bestowed upon you is not lost. He who gave it has it. Suppose that you are unwilling to receive it. It still belongs to you before it is returned. You cannot lose anything, because what you take away from yourself, you nevertheless gain yourself. The matter revolves in a circle within yourself. By receiving you give. By giving you receive. 9. It is our duty, argues our adversary, to bestow benefits upon ourselves. Therefore, we ought also to be grateful to ourselves. The original axiom upon which the inference depends is untrue. For no one bestows benefits upon himself, but obeys the dictates of his nature, which disposes him to affection for himself, and which makes him take the greatest pains to avoid hurtful things, and to follow after those things which are profitable to him. Consequently, the man who gives to himself is not generous, nor is he who pardons himself forgiving, nor is he who is touched by his own misfortunes tender-hearted. It is natural to do those things to oneself, which when done to others become generosity, clemency, and tenderness of heart. A benefit is a voluntary act, but to do good to oneself is an instinctive one. The more benefits a man bestows, the more beneficent he is. Yet whoever was praised for having been of service to himself, or for having rescued himself from brigands, no one bestows a benefit upon himself any more than he bestows hospitality upon himself. No one gives himself anything, any more than he lends himself anything. If each man bestows benefits upon himself, is always bestowing them, and bestows them without any cessation, then it is impossible for him to make any calculation of the number of his benefits. When then can he show his gratitude, seeing that by the very act of doing so, he would bestow a benefit? For what distinction can you draw between giving himself a benefit or receiving a benefit for himself, when the whole transaction takes place in the mind of the same man? Suppose that I have freed myself from danger, then I have bestowed a benefit upon myself. Suppose I free myself a second time. By so doing, do I bestow or repay a benefit? In the next place, even if I grant the primary axiom, that we can bestow benefits upon ourselves, I do not admit that which follows. For even if we can do so, we ought not to do so. Wherefore? Because we receive a return for them at once. It is right for me to receive a benefit, than to lie under an obligation, than to repay it. Now here there is no time for remaining under an obligation, because we receive the return without any delay. No one really gives except to another. No one owes except to another. No one repays except to another. An act which always requires two persons cannot take place within the mind of one. 10. A benefit means the affording of something useful, and the word affording implies other persons. Would not a man be thought mad if he said that he had sold something to himself? Because selling means alienation, and the transferring of a thing, and of one's rights in that thing to another person. Yet giving, like selling anything, consists in making it pass away from you, handing over what you yourself once owned into the keeping of someone else. If this be so, no one ever gave himself a benefit, because no one gives to himself. If not, two opposites coalesce, so that it becomes the same thing to give and to receive. Yet there is a great difference between giving and receiving. How should there not be, seeing that these words are the converse of one another? Still, if any one can give himself a benefit, there can be no difference between giving and receiving. I said a little before that some words apply only to other persons, and are so constituted that their whole meaning lies apart from ourselves. For instance, I am a brother, but a brother of some other man, for no one is his own brother. I am an equal, but equal to somebody else, for who is equal to himself? A thing which is compared to another thing is unintelligible without that other thing. A thing which is joined to something else does not exist apart from it, so that which is given does not exist without the other person, nor can a benefit have any existence without another person. This is clear from the very phrase which describes it, to do good, yet no one does good to himself, any more than he favors himself, or is on his own side. I might enlarge further upon this subject, and give many examples. Why should benefits not be included among those acts which require two persons to perform them? Many honorable, most admirable, and highly virtuous acts cannot take place without a second person. Fidelity is praised, and held to be one of the chief blessings known among men. Yet was anyone ever on that account said to have kept faith with himself? 11. I come now to the last part of this subject. The man who returns a kindness ought to expend something, just as he who repays expends money. But the man who returns a kindness to himself expends nothing, just as he who receives a benefit from himself gains nothing. A benefit and gratitude for it must pass to and fro between two persons. Their interchange cannot take place within one man. He who returns a kindness does good, in his turn, to him from whom he has received something. But the man who returns his own kindness, to whom does he do good? To himself? Is there any one who does not regard the returning of a kindness and the bestowal of a benefit as distinct acts? He who returns a kindness to himself does good to himself. Was any man ever unwilling to do this, even though he were ungrateful? Nay, whoever was ungrateful from any other motive than this? If, it is argued, we are right in thanking ourselves, we ought to return our own kindness. Yet we say, I am thankful to myself for having refused to marry that woman, or for having refused to join a partnership with that man. When we speak thus, we are really praising ourselves, and make use of the language of those who return thanks to approve our own acts. A benefit is something which, when given, may or may not be returned. Now, he who gives a benefit to himself must needs receive what he gives. Therefore, this is not a benefit. A benefit is received at one time and is returned at another. But when a man bestows a benefit upon himself, he both receives it and returns it at the same time. And a benefit, too. What we commend and admire is, that a man has for the time being forgot his own interests, in order that he may do good to another, that he has deprived himself of something, in order to bestow it upon another. Now he who bestows a benefit upon himself does not do this. The bestowal of a benefit is an act of companionship. It wins some man's friendship, and lays some man under an obligation. But to bestow it upon oneself is no act of companionship. It wins no man's friendship, lays no man under an obligation, raises no man's hopes, or leads him to say, this man must be courted. He bestowed a benefit upon that person. Perhaps he will bestow one upon me also. A benefit is a thing which one gives not for one's sake, but for the sake of him to whom it is given. But he who bestows a benefit upon himself does so for his own sake. Therefore, it is not a benefit. 12. Now I seem to you not to have made good what I said at the beginning of this book. You say that I am far from doing what is worth anyone's while. Nay, that in real fact I have thrown away all my trouble. Wait, and soon you will be able to say this more truly. For I shall lead you into covert lurking places, from which when you have escaped, you will have gained nothing, except that you will have freed yourself from difficulties with which you need never have hampered yourself. What is the use of laboriously untying knots which you yourself have tied, in order that you might untie them? Yet, just as some knots are tied in fun and for amusement, so that a tyro may find difficulty in untying them, which knots he who tied them can loose without any trouble, because he knows the joinings and the difficulties of them. And these, nevertheless, afford us some pleasure, because they test the sharpness of our wits and engross our attention. So also these questions, which seem subtle and tricky, prevent our intellects becoming careless and lazy, for they ought at one time to have a field given them to level, in order that they may wander about it, and at another to have some dark and rough passage thrown in their way for them to creep through, and make their way with caution. It is said by our opponent that no one is ungrateful, and this is supported by the following arguments. A benefit is that which does good, but as you Stoics say, no one can do good to a bad man. Therefore, a bad man does not receive a benefit. If he does not receive it, he need not return it. Therefore, no bad man is ungrateful. Furthermore, a benefit is an honorable and commendable thing. No honorable or commendable thing can find any place with a bad man. Therefore, neither can a benefit. If he cannot receive one, he need not repay one. Therefore, he does not become ungrateful. Moreover, as you say, a good man does everything rightly. If he does everything rightly, he cannot be ungrateful. A good man returns a benefit, a bad man does not receive one. If this be so, no man, good or bad, can be ungrateful. Therefore, there is no such thing in nature as an ungrateful man. The word is meaningless. We Stoics have only one kind of good, that which is honorable. This cannot come to a bad man, for he would cease to be bad if virtue entered into him. But as long as he is bad, no one can bestow a benefit upon him, because good and bad are contraries, and cannot exist together. Therefore, no one can do good to such a man, because whatever he receives is corrupted by his vicious way of using it. Just as the stomach, when disordered by disease and secreting bile, changes all the food which it receives, and turns every kind of sustenance into a source of pain, so whatever you entrust to an ill-regulated mind becomes to it a burden, an annoyance, and a source of misery. Thus the most prosperous and the richest men have the most trouble, and the more property they have to perplex them, the less likely they are to find out what they really are. Nothing, therefore, can reach bad men which would do them good, nay, nothing which would not do them harm. They change whatever falls to their lot into their own evil nature, and things which elsewhere would, if given to better men, be both beautiful and profitable, are ruinous to them. They cannot therefore bestow benefits, because no one can give what he does not possess, and therefore they lack the pleasure of doing good to others. 13. But though this be so, yet even a bad man can receive some things which resemble benefits, and he will be ungrateful if he does not return them. There are good things belonging to the mind, to the body, and to fortune. A fool or a bad man is debarred from the first, those, that is, of the mind, but he is admitted to a share in the two latter, and if he does not return them, he is ungrateful. Nor does this follow from our Stoic system alone. The Peripatetics, also, who widely extend the boundaries of human happiness, declare that trifling benefits reach bad men, and that he who does not return them is ungrateful. We therefore do not agree that things which do not tend to improve the mind should be called benefits, yet do not deny that these things are convenient and desirable. Such things as these a bad man may bestow upon a good man, or may receive from him, such, for example, as money, clothes, public office, or life, and if he makes no return for these, he will come under the denomination of ungrateful. But how can you call a man ungrateful for not returning that which you say is not a benefit? Some things, on account of their similarity, are included under the same designation, although they do not really deserve it. Thus, we speak of a silver or golden box. The original word is pix, which means a box made of boxwood. Thus, we call a man illiterate, although he may not be utterly ignorant, but only not acquainted with the higher branches of literature. Thus, seeing a badly dressed, ragged man, we say that we have seen a naked man. These things, of which we spoke, are not benefits, but they possess the appearance of benefits. Then, just as they are quasi-benefits, so your man is quasi-ungrateful, not really ungrateful. This is untrue, because both he who gives and he who receives them speaks of them as benefits. So he who fails to return the semblance of a real benefit is as much an ungrateful man as he who mixes a sleeping draught, believing it to be poison, is a poisoner. 14. Cleanthes speaks more impetuously than this. Granted, says he, that what he received was not a benefit, yet he is ungrateful, because he would not have returned a benefit if he had received one. So he who carries deadly weapons, and has intentions of robbing and murdering, is a brigand, even before he has dipped his hands in blood. His wickedness consists and is shown in action, but does not begin thereby. Men are punished for sacrilege, although no one's hands can reach to the gods. How, asks our opponent, can anyone be ungrateful to a bad man, since a bad man cannot bestow a benefit? In the same way, I answer, because that which he received was not a benefit, but was called one. If anyone receives from a bad man any of those things which are valued by the ignorant, and of which bad men often possess great store, it becomes his duty to make a return in the same kind, and to give back as though they were truly good, those things which he received as though they were truly good. A man is said to be in debt, whether he owes gold pieces or leather marked with a state stamp, such as the Lacedaemonians used, which passes for coined money. Pay your debts in that kind in which you incurred them. You have nothing to do with the definition of benefits, or with the question whether so great and noble a name ought to be degraded by applying it to such vulgar and mean matters as these, nor do we seek for truth, that we may use it to the disadvantage of others. Do you adjust your minds to the semblance of truth, and while you are learning what is really honorable, respect everything to which the name of honor is applied. 15. In the same way, argues our adversary, that your school proves that no one is ungrateful, you afterwards prove that all men are ungrateful. For as you say, all fools are bad men. He who has one vice has all vices. All men are both fools and bad men. Therefore all men are ungrateful. Well, what then? Are they not? Is not this the universal reproach of the human race? Is there not a general complaint that benefits are thrown away, and that there are very few men who do not requite their benefactors with the basest ingratitude? Nor need you suppose that what we say is merely the grumbling of men who think every act wicked and depraved which falls short of an ideal standard of righteousness. Listen, I know not who it is who speaks, yet the voice with which he condemns mankind proceeds not from the schools of philosophers, but from the midst of the crowd. Host is not safe from guest, father-in-law from son, but seldom love exists twixt brothers. Wives long to destroy their husbands, husbands long to slay their wives. This goes even further. According to this, Crimes take the place of benefits, and men do not shrink from shedding the blood of those for whom they ought to shed their own. We requite benefits by steel and poison. We call laying violent hands upon our own country, and putting down its resistance by the fasces of its own lictors, gaining power and great place. Every man thinks himself to be in a mean and degraded position if he has not raised himself above the constitution. The armies which are received from the state are turned against her, and a general now says to his men, "Fight against your wives, fight against your children, march in arms against your altars, your hearths and homes." Yes. Footnote. I believe, in spite of Gertz, that this is part of the speech of the Roman general, and that the conjecture of Meritus, without the command of the Senate, gives better sense. End of footnote. You, who even when about to triumph, ought not to enter the city at the command of the Senate, and who have often, when bringing home a victorious army, been given an audience outside the walls, you now, after slaughtering your countrymen, stained with the blood of your kindred, march into the city with standards erect. Let liberty, say you, be silent amidst the ensigns of war. And now that wars are driven far away, and no ground for terror remains, let that people which conquered and civilized all nations be beleaguered within its own walls, and shudder at the sight of its own eagles. 16. Coriolanus was ungrateful, and became dutiful late, and after repenting of his crime, he did indeed lay down his arms, but only in the midst of his unnatural warfare. Catalina was ungrateful. He was not satisfied with taking his country captive without overturning it, without dispatching the hosts of the Allobroges against it, without bringing an enemy from beyond the Alps to glut his old inborn hatred, and to offer Roman generals the sacrifices which had been long owing to the tombs of the Gaulish dead. Caius Marius was ungrateful, when, after being raised from the ranks to the consulship, he felt that he would not have wreaked his vengeance upon fortune, and would sink to his original obscurity, unless he slaughtered Romans as freely as he had slaughtered the Cimbri, and not merely gave the signal, but was himself the signal for civil disasters and butcheries. Lucius Sulla was ungrateful, for he saved his country by using remedies worse than the perils with which it was threatened, when he marched through human blood all the way from the citadel of Praeneste to the Colline Gate, fought more battles and caused more slaughter afterwards within the city, and most cruelly after the victory was won, most wickedly after quarter had been promised them, drove 2 legions into a corner, and put them to the sword, and great gods invented a prescription by which he who slew a Roman citizen received indemnity, a sum of money, everything but a civic crown. Cneius Pompeius was ungrateful for the return which he made to his country for 3 consulships, 3 triumphs, and the innumerable public offices into most of which he thrust himself when under age, was to lead others also to lay hands upon her, under the pretext of thus rendering his own power less odious, as though what no one ought to do became right if more than one person did it, whilst he was coveting extraordinary commands, arranging the provinces so as to have his own choice of them, and dividing the whole state with a third person, footnote, Crassus, end of footnote, in such a manner as to leave 2/3 of it in the possession of his own family. Footnote, Pompey was married to Caesar's daughter. Confer Virgil, Aeneid, 6, 831, Secreturca, and Lucian's beautiful verses. Pharsalia, 1, 114. End of footnote. He reduced the Roman people to such a condition that they could only save themselves by submitting to slavery. The foe and conqueror. Footnote, Seneca is careful to avoid the mention of Caesar's name, which might have given offense to the emperors under whom he lived, and who used the name as a title. End of footnote. Of Pompeius was himself ungrateful. He brought war from Gaul and Germany to Rome, and he, the friend of the populace, the champion of the commons, pitched his camp in the Circus Flaminius nearer to the city than Porcia's camp had been. He did indeed use the cruel privileges of victory with moderation, as was said at the time. He protected his countrymen, and put to death no man who was not in arms. Yet what credit is there in this? Others used their arms more cruelly, but flung them away when gutted with blood, while he, though he soon sheathed the sword, never laid it aside. Antonius was grateful to his dictator, who he declared was rightly slain, and whose murderers he allowed to depart to their commands in the provinces. As for his country, after it had been torn to pieces by so many proscriptions, invasions, and civil wars, he intended to subject it to kings, not even of Roman birth, and to force that very state to pay tribute to eunuchs. Footnote, the allusion is to Antonius's connection with Cleopatra. Confer Virgil, Aeneid, 8, 688. End of footnote. Which had itself restored sovereign rights, autonomy, and immunities to the Achaeans, the Rhodians, and the people of many other famous cities. End of section 15. Recording by Arden.